Welcome everyone to this conversation hosted by KPI Center for Racial Justice at UCSC, Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective. We're going to be sort of starting off with an introduction to the Ending the Korean War teaching syllabus and focusing on a particular manifestation that guides this conversation. And then after moving through sort of a presentation of Joo Ok's work and responses from different participants, we're going to be doing a sort of breakout room discussion and conversation. So it's great to see you all. There's so many people filing in who I'll just continue to admit, and then I will pass on the baton to Christine and Youngoh. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Chiza. Thank you, Chiza, so much for doing a great deal of the organizing of tonight's event behind the scenes. And I want to thank the members of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective, everyone who will be engaging in this conversation today. And I also wanted to again thank the Korea Policy Institute and the Center for Racial Justice at Santa Cruz for co-sponsoring. My name is Christine Hong. I'm with the Korea Policy Institute. The people who will be speaking today will simply self-introduce. I wanted to say too, so I'm a member of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective, and one of the things we want to do in this year, it's the 70th anniversary of the signing of the Korean War Armistice Agreement that has a war that has yet to be brought to an end. One thing that we were realizing is that so many of us who are part of this teaching collective have published research on the Korean War. And so as part of our teaching initiative and as a way of enacting the political education of our syllabus, we wanted to host events, a few events a year, both showcasing the work of members of the collective, as well as the scholarship, the writing, the activist research of other people. So please stay tuned. By signing up for this event, you have signed up for the KPI email list, and so you're on it, and we will keep you posted about upcoming events. And so Youngoh and I wanted to introduce you to the Ending the Korean War syllabus. And some of you already may have some acquaintance with this. This is a project that is being unfolded module by module. Thus far, we have 9 modules that are planned, only one of which has been rolled out. And that module is the manifestations module. Chiza, would you mind calling that up? And Youngoh, would you also like to introduce yourself while Chiza is calling that up?
Hi, everyone. My name is Youngoh. Okay, little glitchy, sorry. My name is Youngoh. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department at UC San Diego, as well as the critical gender studies graduate certificate program. And I'm also a core member of the Korean War Teaching Collective. And I think this part, me and Christine, we're gonna just go over the manifestations for the module that we're gonna discuss today.
Yes, and I think I just wanted to say something while Chiza's calling it up for you to see. Okay, so you could see it here. This is the Korea Policy Institute website, and the Ending the Korean War syllabus is housed on this website. If you go, if you see the menu tabs at the very top, if you go over to the right, projects, and click on that, the very last item is the Ending the Korean War Teaching Initiative. And if you click on that, it'll take you to this site. And if you scroll down, you see that we have our first module. It's the reverberations module. If you click on that, you'll see that, and you scroll down a bit, you'll see that there's a description of the reverberations module more generally. And this is a way of thinking about how the Korean War, far from being a temporally demarcated event that ended in 1953, persists to this day, and it corresponds to a formidable global infrastructure of violence. And part of the thing that we want to do as a collective was to think about how is it that the war persists on the so-called lower frequencies in both obvious ways and ways that oftentimes are sort of hidden from sort of spectacular view. So, you know, how do we think about, for example, the ongoing division of the Korean Peninsula, the partition of the Korean people as an ongoing manifestation of the war? How do we think, and then the one that we're going to focus on today is militarized migration, kinship, and diaspora. Before you go, okay, yeah. And then you can see, if you just go back, that there are other manifestations as well that speak to the persistence of the Korean War, oftentimes in ways that are far from obvious. So Cheese, if you wouldn't mind clicking on this, yes, if you click on that, you can see that at the top of this manifestation, you have the artwork of Young Min. And this comes from a series called Defining Moments from the early 1990s. Many of us might be familiar with this artwork, but I think that it's really, I think if we could just even dwell on this image, you could see that away from the way that the Korean War is normally periodized in a linear fashion. It begins in 1950 with North Korea aggressing the 38th parallel. It ends in 1953. Against that kind of conventional periodization, instead, time is represented in this image as a spiral. And you see that it begins with 1953, which is the ending that is not an ending. It is the armistice that is not a peace. And from this non-peace spiraling outward, you see the student uprising of 1960 that ousts Lee Seung-man. And going from there, you have Gwangju, you know, and then going from there, you have Los Angeles 1992. And this is all understood to be in a kind of cyclical temporality, all on the body of a woman, on the intimate registers. And you see on the left-hand side for us, occupied, on the right-hand side, territory. And so one of the things that we wanted to do as a collective when we began was to really rethink how it is that the Korean War has been narrated. What is the commonplace historiography of the Korean War? And how do we understand the ways in which archives have been understood, the way that methods have been understood, the ways of knowing around the Korean War, and how do we also address the intense masculinism of Korean War studies? And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to view our project as political education that wasn't aimed simply at informing people about the Korean War, but inviting people to partake of this political education project with an eye to all of our liberation. And so how do we decolonize approaches to the Korean War? How do we de-Cold War our approaches to the Korean War? How do we de-imperialize approaches to the Korean War? In building the syllabus, we were insisting on the fact that our methods had to be feminist, third worldist. They had to be from below and to the left. And not only were we thinking about, okay, how has the Korean War oftentimes been thought of as a fratricidal war, the sort of idea of it being brothers at war? How has kinship been mobilized to tell the story? Actually, could you hold on, Gisette? Could you go back up? How could it be, how is it that kinship has been mobilized to tell the story of the Korean War? And how is it that the ways that kinship lurks in the way that the Korean War is told also infects Korean studies and also informs and distorts the state formation of South Korea. So how do we understand all of this? And how do we also understand how kinship informs even liberatory notions of reunification? So these are all questions that we had in mind, and we wanted to make sure that instead of thinking about a critical feminist, anti-imperialist lens simply being added onto the syllabus, that it be the foundation and the lens through which the syllabus is created. And so I wanted to say something before we scroll down, which is that some years ago, I interviewed one of the standing commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Kim Dong-chun. And I asked him this question. I said, so there's so many different ways in which we could forget the Korean War. And I said, and forgetting even Han's arguably progressive efforts to redress the legacies, the violent legacies of the Korean War. And I asked him specifically about the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the fact that it did not address sexual violence against women before, during, or in the sort of this continuation period of the Korean War. So I asked him about the gendered war politics of the Korean War, and to consider this as an unconsidered aspect of South Korea's state formation, its wartime conduct, and its legacy during the Korean War. And what he stated was this: unfortunately, the TRCK did not specifically investigate sexual violence against women. Understandably, victims would not come forward to testify about being sexually violated, especially if the perpetrators were South Korean or US soldiers. In making the Framework Act, and that's for the TRCK, we should have been attentive not just to those who were killed, but also to those who survived sexual violence. This was a very significant lapse. Investigation into wartime rape would have clarified not just the gendered nature of the conflict, but also the gendered nature of the state that came to be formed by the Korean War. So this is something that he stated. So what I'd like to do is pass things over. So in other words, like, you could read this description on your own and to think about like this in terms of how it also impacts not only notions of the Korean people, the notions of normative notions of the Korean people, how does kinship inform that, but also how does it also extend throughout the diaspora? And so I wanted to pass things over right now to Youngoh.
So I'll just go over briefly the keywords and some of the framing questions that we have. So if we scroll down a little bit, we kind of go to keywords. Some of the keywords for this module are basically adoption, separated families, military brides, mixed race, intergenerational legacies, DMZ in the diaspora, and memory and belonging. And we'll, of course, also add kinship later to this list. And all of these keywords are very much connected and interrelated to each other. And this work of developing our syllabus and framing various questions that would lead to fruitful discussions is an ongoing progress for all of us at the collective. And if we scroll down, we kind of get to the main questions that we have. And for us, in relation to our collective discussion of warring genealogies, I'm sorry, Chiza, can we go back to the keywords again? Sorry. I think for us, out of the keywords, adoption, intergenerational legacies, and memory and belonging, and of course, kinship are the keywords to keep in mind. And if we look below the keywords, here are some of the framing questions that we have posed. And throughout our discussion, we'll also pose questions from here or relevant ones that are in line with how we're trying to the Korean War. So for example, if we look at number 6, I'll just read it out for everybody. what other sources and archives of memory might we galvanize to refuse nationalist memory politics and offer radically different conditions to study the Korean War? So from our discussions of various sources that's about to take place, we can see how complicated and in-depth these archives are and how they invite us to think more deeply about the memories and stories that really define these sources, yet are framed through a master narrative that unfortunately exploits them through silences or forms of appropriation. And also, if we go below the questions, are some of the study materials we have consisting of scholarly books and articles, documentaries, art, novels, interviews, and more. And if you click on the read more button, you can read the annotated summary of each material. And yeah, so that's kind of the explanation of the keywords and the framing questions.
And I would just add that this is a syllabus that is a work in progress. If there are materials that you think should be added to any part of the syllabus, let us know. This is also an open collaborative project. If you're interested in taking part, we welcome you to join your strength to ours. So this is, again, like, something that we can add to, we can change, we can revise over time. And we will continue to build this as a resource for everyone, an open access resource. And we hope that you will teach from this, you will draw upon this as a resource for yourselves. So Joo Ok.
Yes. All right. Thank you everyone for joining. And I'm Joo Ok Kim, a core member of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective. And as of July 1st, I'll be Associate Professor of Literature at UC San Diego. I really appreciate everyone joining us this evening or morning for Hosu and for engaging the first chapter of my book. So many thanks to Korea Policy Institute and to the Center for Racial Justice at UC Santa Cruz for hosting this event. And I'm especially grateful to members of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective, including Youngoh Jung, Hosu Kim, Christine Hong, and Chisa Hughes for their work in organizing today's discussion. I am going to share my screen for the document for today's discussion on the first chapter. And I wanted to share a little bit about how I came, to explain what this document is and how I came across it and the role it has in thinking through, again, the unended reverberations of the Korean War and how we might think through a decolonial end to the war. So for those of you who read Korean, the image registers immediately as Korean language written upside, or the document itself is reprinted upside down. And this document is reprinted in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary's prison magazine, The New Era. And Leavenworth is in the state of Kansas. I know that I have at least one colleague from, and excuse me, let me revise. I have one very dear friend from Kansas who has joined by phone today. And this letter, which has been reprinted upside down, documents the adoption of a Korean boy named Bongnam. The adoption itself was by proxy, which is to say that it was through sponsorships by the sending of letters and monies to support this child through Save the Children Federation. And for the Leavenworth Penitentiary prisoners, this was one of the ways that they were able to participate in the Korean War, as beyond their insistence that they be released to go fight in Korea, as they say, Americans, your own flesh and blood. But one of the things, and the other thing that I wanted to mention about the New Era, which is Leavenworth's prison magazine, is that it has had its moments of more progressive and leftist emergence. During World War I is one of those moments. During the 60s and 70s, the moments of Chicano movements, that was another moment. This moment when I'm examining in the immediate quote unquote aftermath of an unended Korean War is not one of those progressive moments. And so this is again, one of the reactionary kind of eras of the new era. And I wanted to inquire, one of the questions that I wanted to invite the audience to think through is, what does it mean for this letter to have been misprinted upside down? Beyond the fact that it's, beyond the fact that nobody at the press knew how to read Korean, and how it might turn on its head our understanding of kinship, our understanding of the formation of two different states on the Korean Peninsula as a result of the war. And I also wanted to explain a little bit how I came to this document. My initial contact with this document was through the Center for the Study of the Korean War. It was a private archive located in Independence, Missouri. And I came across a proceeding from one of the conferences convened by the Center for the Study of the Korean War, which referenced this document. And I was so curious about, the fact that Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary prisoners in the state of Kansas were engaging with the Korean War in this way. And my actual access to the documents themselves were through the National Archives of Kansas City. And so this is part of my dissertation research in the literature department at UC San Diego. And one of the, backstories for why I had such proximity to the Center for the Study of the Korean War, which I should mention is now part of the Truman Library, which is under the administration of the National Archives, is that I grew up in Kansas. And I grew up with, going to different archives and libraries specifically about the Korean War with my dad throughout my childhood. And one of those was the center, another was the Truman Library. And here I wanted to quickly read a section of my coda from Warring Genealogies. And I will also share the screen for that as well, so that folks can read along if they would like to. Excuse me while I work on it. I feel like I've been on Zoom for ages and I still cannot share screens. Okay, can you see? I will again read a section of this out loud. I'm born in the southern part of the Korean Peninsula. In 1988, I'm part of the Korean diaspora, a military empire settler diaspora to the US Midwest. I grew up in Kansas, learning early on to field questions about whether I support North or South Korea, to navigate expectant gratitude from random white US veterans of the Korean War. As a kid, I go with my dad to the Truman Library and Archives in Independence, Missouri, which is a 30-minute drive from where we live in Kansas. I find it all to be pretty boring. I want to play Tetris on my Game Boy instead. A few years later, there's famine in North Korea, newspapers vibrantly inked with photos of emaciated children, babies. They blame it on water, a series of droughts and floods, on natural disasters, although following Christine Hong's work on US sanctions, there's no such thing as a natural disaster. They don't mention US sanctions, only US aid, or when they do mention sanctions, it's in the bewildered way of, quote, why these miserable, incontestably inferior rice-eating gooks refuse to come to heel and would not be saved, end quote. The perspective of white parents who've sent their children to fight in the Korean War, as observed by James Baldwin. Considering continuing the visitation of archives, I go with my dad to the Center for the Study of the Korean War, then housed in Graceland University, now part of the Truman Library. here on ancestral Osage and Kaw lands in a Korean War archive in a city named for autonomous freedom, a city written into the day declaring US freedom from colonial rule, a Louisiana purchase city, a point of departure city for manifest destiny projects, I open folder after folder, sift through box after box. In one, I find mention of the New Era's prison magazine articles on the Korean War. And I'm going to stop sharing there and share quickly the translation of the letter for those of you who do not read Korean. And I'm sorry it's so tiny. Maybe I can make it a little bit bigger. And the part that I wanted to direct our attention to, and one of the questions that I had about this document and for this conversation had to do with thinking about the quote unquote emergence, or, to use metaphors of kinship, biological kinship, the birth of the South Korean nation state in relation to this particular proxy adoption by Leavenworth prisoners, is this final line of the first paragraph, which states, in Seoul, the capital of Korea, reconstruction work is being done extensively. And I was so struck by the compelled expectation, of course, that for this letter to pass through and to be sent, that the capital of Korea could only be Seoul. And so that's one of the questions that I had for later on in the conversation. And I think my time is up, so I will leave it there.
So we'll move to Hosu.
Hi, my name is Hosu Kim, and I'm an associate professor of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the College of Staten Island City as a part of City University of New York. And so once again, and thank you very much for organizing this very important teaching initiative. And also, I feel very, very honored to be part of this conversation. So, so Joo Ok's research on the proxy adoption by the Leavenworth prisoners illuminates how U.S. imperial militarization deploys intimacy and whiteness to expand and manage not only geopolitical hegemony, but also to the U.S. racial order. By bringing Nam to the US via proxy adoption, these white prisoners are given an opportunity to redeem their sins and reintegrate into imagined patriarchal and dutiful citizenry. The rhetorical gesture toward militarized and institutionalized kinship between Nam and white inmates was made possible by the Korean War and the civil death onto both parties. 4 years later, and the New Era delivered Nam's progressive report to his fathers in the US, according to Joo Ok's work. The issue reiterates the necessity of aid because, quote, Nam is living with his mother and his grandmother. No news has been heard of the missing father. His mother is determined to do whatever is best for her son without her husband. The Nam still needs the help of his friends at Leavenworth, end quote. The precondition of the orphanhood for Nam and fatherhood for the Leavenworth white prisoners spelled out in the missing Nam's father. The New Era's progressive report rationalized the continuity of the proxy adoption based on unreturned Nam's father, and this actually prompted the question, where had Nam's father been even 4 years after the Korean War was paused. So now I'm going to share some of the images and which actually contain the human bones in trench, which might evoke discomfort or distrust in the audience. So please be aware. So everybody looking okay? Yeah, all right. Conjuring up Bongnam's missing father, I'd like to introduce the term of the missing as a reverberating coordinate of the Korean War. First, you see the number of the missing across 3 different state violence in gray box chronologically. As Christine mentioned earlier, this periodization of the Korean War. And the first one is the April 3rd. The second is the Korean War, with a wide range of the estimate between 200,000 and 1 million of missing. And the third is the May 18th Gwangju uprising. Across all these sites, the missing is the constant reminder of the state violence. First, state violence that has not been resolved. The first 3 photos on the left corner, 4 photos, I'm sorry, left corners, indicate the first site of mass killing in 1950 July here. The second is the burial site 6 years after the family retrieved the remains of their loved ones. And third photo over here is the stone memorial called Baekjo Ilson in Jeju. It means we as descendants are the one of the 100 ancestors. The term reclaims that their relatedness through acknowledgement of state violence, wrongful indictment, brutal killing, desertion of the dead, foreclosure of the proper burials with armed guards for the next 6 years. It has taken 6 years when the families finally got closer to the massacre site. There was no way that one could distinguish the remaining bones individually due to the topographical and frequent rains of Jeju. The families of the massacre laid out the 132 coffins, excavated, took out the skulls, hips, hip bones, all limb bones, and recomposed human bodies. In this reassembling, their loved ones at multiply violated emerged a new kinship, which I called insurgent kinship. The insurgent kinship is a particular type of kinship based on griefs, unspeakable, irretrievable, yet unstoppable, taking with all risk of taking civil death, social, economic, familial exclusion in the milieu of the Cold War and its continuing legacy against the state reparations. In this right side of the photograph, you see pictures of excavation of a mass killing. Since 2005, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the Republic of Korea launched, the mass killing of the civilian during the Korean War came into light. Search for the missing dead and excavation began and continues since then. Currently, more than 170 sites were identified for the massacre site during the Korean War, waiting to be investigated. The one that you see at the moment is the recent discovery of the human remains near Daejeon Penitentiary, where more than 400 political prisoners related to the April 3rd state and putatively were killed. To their family members, all of these were missing. This year marked the 70th year after the Korean War was ceased. Yet, we still don't know the exact number of the missing and their whereabouts. Like Bongnam's father. As I have explored the term of the missing for my research, at first as debris of adoption archives, and the second as unresolved issue of the state violence in Gwangju, I came to realize much of our missing is in the ground, and perhaps we are all part of the missing. The bottom photos, I juxtapose the recent unearthing of the mass killing in Trench and the harvest of the potato in Trench. This is effective analysis, perhaps the register for the missing in the Korean War. Here are my two questions. What might mean and take to think about the missing of the April 3rd May Gwangju uprising and any other yet to be claimed or recognized as state violence as a part of the Korean War disappearance? Is this sweeping generalization? Or what possibilities might such thinking practice offer to resolve a competitive rubrics or politics of recognition? And earlier, as I have mentioned, insurgent kinship born and out of griefs at the sites brutally violated, as we contend the land as a forensic archive of the missing. With what and whom is a such insurgent kinship legible? These are two thoughts that I got prompted by Joo Ok's work and the missing father. And of course, we talk about this living birth mother and living mother, and yet seen as a birth mother, right? And socially that figures of numerous Korean women who have been erased and never really seen as, I guess, any kind of part of this important, I guess, conversation of transnational and generational reproductive injustice. So I would like to end my thoughts there. Thank you.
Hosu, thank you so much. Youngoh?
Thank you, Hosu. Thank you, Christine. I'm Youngoh for those who came in after I introduced myself. I'm a PhD candidate at UC San Diego in the history department and the critical gender studies program. So I'm super excited to be part of this discussion. And as Joo Ok's book really reminds me, why I'm writing and doing the work I do in the first place. And I was actually excitedly browsing through my primary source documents to pick something out, but really put them away after finishing the coda of Joo Ok's book, where she poses a question: what is our relationship to the Korean War? And I read the question as a call for reflection on our positionality and how searching for the most ethical way to approach the possible answers shape us and our relationship with one another, even if we can't find the answers in an academic disciplinary blueprint scholars are accustomed to. And it got me to think of my positionality as a Korean American and a historian of Korea and the Korean diaspora, and how my sense of belonging, kinship, and also shapes my work. So my primary source that I want to share with y'all is actually a story, a memory that I refuse to turn into a source, a memory of war and life my grandmother shared with me. And some of the questions I want to pose I'll put it in the chat right now. It includes the question 4 from our framing questions from the module, which is how our memories of the war passed implicitly and explicitly across generation. And 2 others are, what is the scholar's responsibility when the archives talks back at you? And what kind of knowledge productions shape our understanding of history, and who determines what is and is now reliable enough to be history? So bear with me, let me tell you a little story right now. So it was the summer of 2013 when I was on a research trip to Seoul, frantically locating and searching the archives to complete my master's thesis on modern Korean history. And for a 2-week period of that summer, most of my family, who were all residing in Seoul at the time, went overseas. So I spent those 2 weeks with my maternal grandmother, who had raised me. And it also has been a very long time since I spent time with her. One day after having lunch together, out of the blue, she just began to tell me her life story. She spoke for nearly 3 hours, filled with emotions, silences, gaps, and faded memories. I remember the surges of joy and sadness, of surprise and fear. I remember how those 3 hours also triggered memories and emotions of my own, as they reminded me of the world of stories that my grandmother opened up for me before I fell asleep as a child. Stories that were interrupted by my impatience of what happened next. And much like then, I blurted out what happened here, or threw out names of events in her life as she spoke. And with much excitement, she promptly supplied me with her memories as they came in no certain order. So, Independence Day, her marveling at the Korean flags covering the streets, thinking how so many were made and distributed so quickly. Marriage at age 16, how my much older grandfather persuaded her father to marry her off to him so that she won't be taken away by the Japanese military. Her voice turned to quiet murmurs and heavy with emotions. The earlier years of her marriage were very difficult for her. War, the cavern below the tall mountains close to her house that her family used as a bomb shelter. The fear she felt when a large group of North Korean troops passed by her house, marching northward, alleviated by a nice North Korean soldier boy that skipped up to her and pleasantly asked her for directions. The American bomb that landed in her front yard shortly after, the silence and the ringing in her ears, the sharp nail that missed her head by inches that blew apart the rooftops, the South Korean Marines who treated her and her neighbors horribly, forcing them to bring food to them like they were servants. Her neighbors were taken away after the North Korean troops retreated, never to be seen again, most likely accused as communists and suspected collaborators. She looks around to see if anyone else is around. The fear, the silence, hesitation, as she's trying to remember their names and their faces. When she started to talk about the war, I reached for my phone and turned on the sound recording app. But before pushing the record button, I clicked off the home screen and slid it away. It was a spontaneous decision, and it has taken me a long time to process why I did not record the conversation that I still don't have the full answers to. And as a historian, I know the value of sources, but something deep inside just said no. My body and mind instinctively reacted, refusing to commodify my grandmother's memories, refusing to render them as a collectible item in the relentless pursuit and desire of more new non-Western knowledge. I also did not know how to comprehend the silences and the entanglements of contradicting emotions exhibited and feared. I also feared that I would misinterpret or exploit her memories. My grandmother's murmurs, whimpers, her fearful reactions of looking over her shoulders, and her heavy voice repeating the question, what was their name? What was their name? What was their name? Her sudden reaction as if someone threatening may be watching. How these responses were accompanied by quick smiles and laughter recalling certain memories. Her excitement in trying to quickly answer her grandson's abrupt questions. These emotional cues said so much about her silences and what could and could not be spoken, as it was embedded in both the gender sociocultural norms and the political power of knowledge formation as well. For instance, when I had my late father read a short blog I had written about my conversation with my grandmother, his only comment was, she shouldn't have called the North Korean soldiers nice. I also began to piece together how comfortable she was in sharing her story with me when my father wasn't present. After that summer, I returned to school and told my thesis advisor about what happened without going into much detail because I didn't feel safe doing so. He expressed disappointment that I did not record my grandmother's memories, and that reassured me that I've done the right thing. What I did went against all the rules and methods I had just begun learning as a new graduate student in modern Korean history, a field that values new non-Western evidence and knowledge as currency. I was taught to begin building my archive by accumulating sources and records as if it was a bank account, taught that this banking of knowledge was what it took to engage the best practices of historiographical writing. However, reliance on sources alone cannot really capture the intimate histories, as well as the practice of kinship and community-based knowledge formation that are far too often dismissed as ahistorical, compromised, and unreliable, mostly for being too personal and too emotional. The history discipline traditionally does not accept concurrent histories of complex personhoods filled with stories of contradicting memories and emotions that are non-linear and non-conforming. And if they are deemed to be acceptable, the unwritten rules of the discipline requires them to be supplemented by empirical data to be recognizable by disciplinary standards. The academic field of history produces knowledge by transforming memories and emotions into commodities that are appropriated to validate an argument. I just didn't want my grandmother's memories to become a source, to be mined and examined in languages and ways that doesn't represent the depth of her memories. And trying to understand that depth of my experience with my grandmother, I also repeatedly asked myself, in the end, who and what is this for? Especially from my positionality as a historian, and also thinking of my responsibility as a grandson. As I struggle with why this was so difficult to grasp, Crystal Beck's conceptualization of durational memory and reencounters really helped me immensely by processing the deeply affective experiences of kinship with my grandmother, which was also an unexpected reencounter of my own, one that I once believed was unattainable due to my physical and emotional distance away from her in the diaspora. I realized this process is also about accountability and healing, not beholden to official rules or a proven formula that prioritizes safety and a sense of community that safeguards memories from exploitation and commodification disguised as scholarly rigor. So I hope this deep reflection helps us reimagine the archives as a living and breathing repository where memories are dignified and deeply cared for. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Youngoh, thank you so much. I wanted to begin by saying that for about 20 years, I have been collecting photo albums from eBay. And these are the photo albums of American GIs who had Kodak Brownie cameras. And all of them, and it was almost a part of their uniforms. And what has emerged from the fact that soldiers on the Korean War battlefields had these kinds of cameras is that there is this archive of photographs that is copious and immense. And what was so striking about the fact that there are so many images that were captured of Korea, of Koreans, of the landscape, of the battlefront by these GIs is that there is no corresponding documentary riches by Koreans. You know, Koreans during this time do not have a documentary or photographic archive that in any way, I mean, there's just virtually nothing. There's just a paucity of materials. And one thing that appears time and again in these photo albums and these collections of photographs are images of Korean War mascots. And so in response to Joo Ok's incredible work and her thinking about how the orphan has been rendered bare by state power, I wanted to dwell on this more. And I wanted to think about the dynamics of racial capitalism and the fact that the dynamics of racial capitalism render kinship non-normative. And it leaves the question of what is family in the wake of imperialist war? If we ask the question, if there's family separation as a standard feature of chattel slavery, if that is an effect of the Middle Passage, if there's family separation as an expected feature of border imperialism, if there is family separation as a result of imperialist war and the settler colonial partition of peoples, then how do we understand the terms of kinship and the lines of affiliation? And what do we make, as Joo Ok invites us to understand, that the men in Leavenworth, these white prisoners, can adopt symbolically a child, right? And this seems to be by proxy popping up some kind of notion of kinship over there, but isn't it really a deterritorialization of the terms of kinship, so that we have to think of them in the terms of kinship anew? And I think that Joo Ok does this in her work. And so I want to say too, that when you look at these photos, these abundant photos from, it's basically these Korean War veterans have died and their families are selling the images, right? When you look at that, it can't but feel like a moment of double consciousness, where you are looking at Korea and Koreans through the lens of low-level functionaries that are embedded with the US war machine. So what does it mean to look at these images? It's extremely discomforting. And so what I was saying is, what pops up time and again are these images of mascots. And I was wondering if you could call up the first image. No, that's not the first one, that's the third one. Yeah. That's the second one. So they're numbered. Yeah, sorry about, okay, we'll go in this order. So what I wanted to say is that sometimes you come across an image that has been captioned, and here you have Sergeant Comer and friend. And so sometimes there is an explanatory addition to the image itself. But how do we understand these mascots who you can see a kind of mirroring in terms of, it's not a total formal fatigues, but the cap is the same. And there's a kind of remaking of this Korean child in the image of the US war machine. And so I was trying to think about, so how do we understand the Korean War mascot? Usually they were framed as orphans, as not having family ties. And this kind of fiction of not having family ties allowed for the Korean War orphan to be remade in the image of the occupier, usually wearing fatigues or sometimes a fully decked out uniform that's like miniaturized for, a child's body. And so one thing that's interesting to me about these images is that there is a kind of social intimacy here. Oftentimes you can imagine that these GIs would take these images back home, so to speak, and they would show these images to family, and they would have some sort of story or tale that accompanies this, but there's some kind of weird intimacy on the battlefront, right? There's something strange about this. And how do we understand what a mascot is? This is a moment in which there were US military units that had chickens, that had chindo dogs, that had horses. And sometimes horses were made honorary unit members, and in fact were then granted passage across the Pacific and granted honorary citizenship, right? So how do we understand what a mascot is? Is the mascot necessarily human or animal or something, some life form in between? Is a mascot a civilian, a Korean civilian, or is a mascot a US soldier or something in between? Is a mascot a stranger, a foreigner, racialized life that is different from American GIs? Or is the mascot kin? Is a mascot a child and assigned freedom from labor, or is a mascot an adult that labors? Is the mascot an American or a Korean, a friend or foe, a beneficiary or a victim? Is a mascot alive or dead? Is a mascot a plaything or labor? Is the mascot an object of paternal love to be adopted, or is the mascot an object of sexual desire? And why is it that the war machine produces these slippages between these categories? And so I came to understand that the mascot is an enemy war remnant. The obverse of the mascot is the mass casualty. So the mascot is that singular life form that is shadowed by mass death. The mascot, and if we borrow here from scholarship and organizing around Native American mascotry, you understand that what is the mascot? The mascot is deterritorialized indigenous life who has been remade in the occupier's image, and the uniform becomes a second skin. But even so, there's something discomforting about the mascot because there is the imprint of a sovereignty other than the occupier's sovereignty that hovers in this image. And so here we have this kind of captioned image. Chiza, would you mind going to the second image? So here you have another image, and in fact, this cap was literally called a cunt cap. And you have this relationship between this American soldier and this Korean child. And the question that I have is, how do we read this relationship? What are the lines of affiliation? That is one of the questions that I want to pose. Can we go to the next image? When I look at this image, and these are all from different collections, I wonder what your response is to this image. I wonder what you make of this. And here I'm reminded of what Sharon Holland states about the erotic. And Sharon Holland says that the erotic is the glue for racist order. And I wonder how we think about that with regard to this image. And we can stop the images right now. So I wanted to say something, which is, I want to say something about how do we think about the figure of the mascot? How do we think about the mascot as a surplus life form drawn from a surplus population? How do we think of the mascot as of the kind of category of surplus life that also includes the comfort woman, both for the Japanese Imperial Army and for the United States forces? How do we think about the mascot also in terms of the racialized incorporation of Black messmen, Black stevedores? How do we think about how kinship to these figures and how all of these figures were assigned the task of reproducing the US military and US militarism? So how do we understand how these non-normative kinship ties have the function of creating comfort for the US military in settings that are home away from home? How do they do reproductive labor for the US war machine? And how are these non-normative practices of kinship essential to the reproduction of systems of imperial violence? So I will just end here with those questions, and we're going to move into breakout sessions. So we're going to move into breakout sessions, and we'll be discussing some of these questions, and we'll reconvene. Is there anything that anyone would like to share from their breakout room? And Julie, you didn't get a chance to speak. I was wondering if you wanted to share your thoughts in this bigger setting, but this is a good setting.
It's totally okay. But thank you, Christine. I was just going to say really quickly, just like 3 things I thought of from your talk, which I think is hopefully speaking to this idea of insurgent kinship, which I love. I don't know, first, when you said, Christine, in your talk about how no Korean families have albums from this time, I thought about, like, I read once in a short story by Son Chang-sub about Korean people who would be employed by the US military to draw portraits of them. Like, and so I wanted to ask you if in your research you ever encountered, I'm so curious about these images that Koreans produced of the US soldiers as a form of labor to make money. And I'm just curious if anybody has encountered that kind of image. I think it would be fascinating. And then I was thinking about, like, in the photographs you presented of the mascots, like, it's always the US soldier and the Korean child, and how there's always, the mascot is not just one figure, it is two. And then I was thinking about, like, other forms of, like, insurgent kinship, like I remember reading in, like, short stories about, like, Korean houseboys and house servants that worked in the camp towns, and how they would kind of be relegated to that, like, domestic labor, and that's how they were getting paid. But how sometimes, like, if a Korean girl and a Korean boy, like, would come together working in that kind of job in, like, the house of a general, say, like, they would form some sort of kinship, and kind of try to find their ways around their employer who was oppressing them. And then I also think about, like, I remember, like, reading from Monica Kim's book about, like, Black soldiers who kind of turned away from the US cause and tried to escape it and tried to, like, forge solidarity with Korean folks. And anyway, I just think of those two kind of groupings as possible moments of insurgent kinship, but I think about how those moments are so underrepresented. Like, I read about those in, like, one moment in a book or in a short story, like a work of fiction, and, like, how that's invisibilized in comparison to, like, the very visible, like, very in your face photographs you presented of the mascots. I don't know what these are just the thoughts I had. I don't think it's a question. So that's just what I wanted to share. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, thank you. I think that we are sufficiently small in number that if people want to bring forward any kind of thoughts, to the larger group, anything that you'd like to share, we wanted this to be an example of the syllabus in action, like we're in a study session together, and what would you bring forward, I'll say one thing, Deanne, Ramsey, and some others and I, some years ago, were pulling together an archive, and it's so interesting to hear Youngoh speak about, when do you choose not to make something into a source? When do you choose not to record it? And we decided to record stories, and in a way, we spoke to a woman who was a pastor's wife. There's, like, the pastor's kid and there's pastor's wife in Orange County, who had a story and didn't know where to put it. Just didn't know where to put it. And her story was of two brothers who volunteered either to be with the partisans in the South or joined the North Korean People's Army. And so, and she couldn't mention their names for decades. And it was only after she had a life-threatening illness and was on the verge of death, she's in Southern California, which is so, the condition of her admission for so many people whose families came over here was anti-communism at the gate. You declare your pledge to anti-communism. And so she had a story, and she had her brother's names, and she hadn't known where to put it or how to articulate it, but then she told her story. And I'm not saying it's always cathartic and it's never that simple, but it was also, there was something about that reclaiming, because the younger of her two older brothers was killed. And his remains are someplace in Chili Mountain. She has no idea where. And no one could even think about the missing, which Hosu was talking about. No one could think, you couldn't dare grieve. You couldn't even grieve. There's no way to materialize your grief.
It looks like, Mark, you have your hand raised. You should go ahead.
Oh yeah, actually, I just have a question too. The recording is just for internal purposes?
No, this recording was intended to be put online in addition to some of the resources that exist on the website.
Okay, I mean, I think I'm okay with that. So I think this just popped into my head, but Christy mentioned like the problem with materializing grief. So in the presentation, someone mentioned positionality. I often feel like I don't have the right to speak because I'm in between two places. And I'm sure people have uttered this or said this before, but it's like this constant state of not being authentic enough, right? And what kind of source am I? I'm not a primary source, I'm not a secondary source, I'm not a tertiary source. My source is all wrong, right? And a lot of Korean Americans, we struggle with even like our mother tongue, right? So according to some Pew Research study, only 20% of second generation Asian Americans identify as being able to speak their mother tongue fluently, which is a huge problem if you're going on this soul search, right? But I have struggled with that for a long time. I wonder if anyone feels that way, if that's stopped them from speaking. So I came back 2 years ago from Korea, and unfortunately, 6 months back into New York City, I don't know if you guys saw the story about the young Korean American woman who was followed into her apartment. She actually was someone I went to church with and Korean school with. And I feel like when you're discussing histories and like racialized violence, people, unfortunately, they don't pay attention until blood literally spills, right? I mean, she was sexually assaulted and killed. And I often feel that way as an Asian American, just like because we're made so invisible in so many ways. And then we are stuck in this weird space, in this liminal space, and then something bad happens. But yeah, I've struggled with the historiographical question because of that in-betweenness. I'm just wondering if other people struggle with that too.
Mark, can I just say something really quickly, which is that, you know, for so long in terms of like who was authorized to speak on the Korean War, I mean, that's what Youngoh was talking about. Like who gets authorized? Who gets authorized and on the basis of what archive? And, you know, like, you know, if and who gets delegitimized or sort of de-authenticated? And how do we understand, like, you know, if you even look at discussion of reunification, there's always a gesture toward the diaspora, always. It's not just North and South, it's also the diaspora. But that's a question for us. That is a question for us. How do we envision reunification? Instead of just being sort of like brought into the dialogue as an afterthought, how do we start to think of this? And, you know, like, what would you say about this? You know what I mean? So in other words, I think it's a question for us. And I was wondering if, Veronica, if you wanted to also, I saw that you had your hand up as well.
Thank you. And thank you for your comments. So I wanted to share what we spoke about in a breakout group, but I also wanted to mention this. Joo Ok, as you know, your work has been very illuminating for all of us. It's precisely about speaking to what Mark says, who has the right and who has the authority to speak about what, and what are the archives that are legitimate about the Korean War. And I think one of the amazing things that Joo Ok's book does, amongst many, is precisely putting into conversation archives, and I mean archives here, literary, news, visual, that are not seen together, precisely because the Korean War, as Christine mentioned yesterday, is also a war that takes place on the train of information, right? And I think this is very important when we think about this. And I think this goes to Youngoh and also Hosu's talks. So one of the things I want to precisely bring up, and it's something that has been mentioned, is the way that Joo Ok uses the words or the proxy as an analytic. and bringing into conversation the ways that Korean War has been seen as a proxy for war, but proxy in the sense of epistemological, spatial, and familial. So in chapter 1, the one that we have discussed, is precisely about proxy adoption, proxy kinship, but also in other chapters where the Chicano soldier is seen as a proxy for racial inclusion, or Korea is seen as a proxy for the US-Mexico border. So what does this proxy, what does it do? And how does this thinking about its temporal and spatial coordinates complicate the way we know or think we must know about the Korean War? And I'm thinking precisely because we mentioned this when we talk about proxy, what are the things that comes into play? And Hosu talked about the fact that it's replaceable, that it's not real, it's not immediate, it's fungible, it can be done as a distance. Cusick also mentioned that it has a pejorative context, right? There is always a hierarchy involved in it. Also, I think if my memory is not correct, please correct me. And I remember that Dylan was talking precisely about the question of disability, right? About able nationalism. So one of the things that I want to bring up precisely in thinking about the proxy is what does it allow to think about beyond the kind of neatness, right? Thinking precisely about the messy genealogies of the Korean War. And one of the things that brought to mind, actually thinking precisely about Hosu's talk, about thinking about 4.3, 5.18, April 3rd, May 18th, in relation to Yu-Gi-Oh, to June 25th, is Lee Mung-soon's documentary, Good Light, Good Air, which was fascinating. As some of you might not know, I'm Korean Argentine. So my parents are Korean and I grew up in Seoul and Buenos Aires. So thinking about the question of the missing in Gwangju and the desaparecidos, disappeared in Buenos Aires, right? And thinking about this precisely, this queer hermeneutic as part and parcel of the Korean War. So I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but I wanted to kind of bring this to fore. And thank you all for inspiring us to think about these things and going beyond the nice little textbooks of the Korean War.
Right. I mean, like, how often are issues of kinship placed first and foremost or front and center in terms of thinking about the war? And it's also Hosu's incredible work along, with Grace Cho in terms of the kinship of violence. I mean, that is such a formative essay for so many of us, and clarity in terms of analysis as well. And so we, for those of you who need to leave, by all means, feel free, but I wanted to make sure that H. Ek has a chance to speak as well.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to say something in particularly for the fellow earlier who was talking about feeling distant and not having the right to speak on it. I believe that somebody responded about pointing to diaspora and how the different people of the diaspora we have our own perspective on things. I think that, like, when we talk about these in my mind, they're very long ago, but they're quite recent. We all have our own perspective on how this has affected us. It's kind of a trip to think about how, man, this country waged war in my nation, and somewhere up the line, my family decided that this child needs to go to that nation in order for this child's survival. If I'm just thinking in terms of my personal experiences, like, this is stuff that I've thought about. I've spoken to people of other diasporas from other nations across the world. And there's always a very incredibly disarming, I don't want to call it cognitive dissonance because I don't know what that word means, but it's just a very weird place to think I am living in a totally different situation from the ones who came before me. And when we speak on it, it doesn't make you less genuine just because your position in terms of this conflict is quote unquote removed. We still experience the ripple effects of these wars and these imperial pursuits. There's the soft imperial power that is persisting today, and of course the traumatic ripple effect through generations. And we all have a truth to speak on that. And I think that if anybody feels that you have a non-genuine approach to that, they're wrong, because you do have your own approach to that. It has affected you in that way. It's just about figuring out, what is authentic for me to actually say when I speak on this historical event. What is my perspective on that? What am I authentically bringing to this? I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it did. I wanted to just say something, which is, I don't know if you have read Martin Manalanson's essay on queer mess and thinking about queer mess as a kind of archive. And like, so how do you, when you go to NARA, the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, everything is organized according to military logic, according to unit number, and that's the way it's organized. You cannot find, it is very difficult to search for something like mascots in the Korean War archive as it is constructed. You might come across some stray element, but there is no sort of, it is reproduced according to a logic of the same logic of imperial domination, that also then informs in terms of its authority, Korean studies as well. And, I just want to say something quickly, which is that years ago, when I was in grad school, there was this anti-communist Koreanist who shook his fist at me and told me, he said, "You're not Korean." And he's like, "You're not Korean, you stupid girl. You don't have any understanding." He said, anyhow, it was his entire thing because of his the intensity of his anti-communism. But I think that we have to be able to think, and Youngoh's work and, Hosu, Joo Ok, so many people here, it's an invitation to reconceive what we understand as the archive and what we understand as methods, really. And how do we understand it in a way that doesn't presuppose mastery of information, facts, etc., right? Like, how do we start to understand the Korean War on its lower registers, on intimate planes, really? I mean, it's a question for us, and it's not an easy one to answer. And Mark, I see that you have your hand up, and I'll give you the last word in just a moment. But what I want to say is that this is our study space together. And we invite you to continue to be in conversation. I see that some of you are here, Silas. I see that you're there's some people who are involved in the early days who are here. And it's so good to be reconnected. And we invite working with you on the syllabus, and we invite you to participate in these conversations as we study together, learn from each other, challenge each other, challenge what's out there. And just thank you for joining us. So Mark, I see that you have your hand up, and I saw, and someone else had their hand up too. I'm so sorry. I maybe that person left. Mark, and then we will bring this conversation to a close.
Okay. Thank you for letting me talk, and thank you for all the comments in the chat. So I guess I'll just conclude by saying that it's been a long time since I read academic text, so I might be misunderstanding some stuff. So I think at some point I read something about the subaltern. So the way I see it now is that I've been thinking about this for a long time, is when you go through the diaspora, like my parents did through like Argentina and myself in Mexico, you see kind of more fragmented truths, right? And you're simultaneously experiencing more coherence and more incoherence, because you can see all the way things can go, or all the directions people have gone. And it's overall like a little overwhelming. But the way, like metaphorically, I conceptualize it is that when the Korean War happened, it broke into a billion pieces and went everywhere. And those edges, they have very jagged edges. I don't feel any shame about the truths I live. And I don't feel like I have to explain myself, but I actually want to address the people who might be feeling alienated or lonely by this, right? There was a lot lost. So, but yeah, I'll continue to think about this, and thank you for organizing this space.
Yeah, just thank you so much. And I wanted to say that Professor Kwon is in the house. And, in late September, we are going to have a really wonderful discussion of Professor Kwon's research on Jeju and Sasam. And, we really invite you to participate in that next session. And we will continue to study together and to converge with each other. And just thank you so much for joining us tonight, everyone. Yeah. Have a good night or a good morning, depending on where you're at. Okay.